Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history. April 27th is one of those dates where history looks at humanity and says, you know what would really help? A dramatic gesture followed immediately by consequences. Today we've got conquerors torching palaces, empires celebrating birthdays while actively falling apart, explorers discovering that local politics can be hazardous to your health, presidents testing the Constitution like it's a door marked push and pull, and people lining up for freedom after generations of being told freedom was for somebody else. So let's begin with the ancient world, where the architecture was magnificent, the egos were larger, and conflict resolution usually involved fire. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great reached Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, after smashing Darius and collecting imperial capitals like a very intense tourist with a sword. Persepolis was not just a city. It was Persia's luxury showroom, spiritual center, royal brag wall, and architectural flex all stacked on a stone terrace. Then, Alexander burned it. Historians still argue whether this was calculated revenge for the Persian burning of Athens or the ancient world's worst drunken party decision. Supposedly, an Athenian courtesan named Thais encouraged the whole thing during a banquet, which means one of history's great imperial capitals may have been destroyed by the phrase, "You know what would be funny?" That is not foreign policy. That is a bachelor party with cavalry. 5 centuries later, Rome held its 1000th birthday party under Emperor Philip the Arab, who desperately needed everyone to believe the empire was eternal, stable, and definitely not cracking like a cheap amphora in July. The games featured gladiators, elephants, tigers, lions, hippos, giraffes, and a rhinoceros, because nothing says civilization will endure forever like turning the Colosseum into Noah's Ark with a murder budget. Philip used the celebration to sell unity, legitimacy, and optimism, but the treasury was drained, the borders were unstable, and soon enough, his own troops found another emperor. So April 27th gives us a useful lesson. If your empire needs smoke machines, mass slaughter, and commemorative coins to prove it is healthy, it may already be on life support wearing a laurel wreath. In 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed from North Africa into Iberia with an army of roughly 7,000 men and landed near the giant limestone rock that would become Gibraltar, from Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. The Visigothic kingdom was politically brittle, internally divided, and ruled by King Roderick, which is how history often begins its "and then everything collapsed" chapter. Tariq's expedition was initially a military intervention, but it opened the door to the Islamic conquest of Hispania and the creation of Al-Andalus, a civilization that would reshape Europe through architecture, philosophy, agriculture, mathematics, medicine, and scholarship. The famous legend says Tariq burned his ships after landing, telling his men that retreat was no longer an option. Whether that literally happened or not, it is one of the boldest motivational speeches in history. Most bosses say, "We're all in this together." Tariq said, "I destroyed the exit strategy." That is leadership by arson. But the deeper point is that this crossing did not just move soldiers. It moved ideas. It connected Africa, Europe, and the wider Islamic world in ways that transformed cities, languages, trade, and knowledge. And like so many turning points, it probably did not feel like a neat historical chapter at the time. It felt like a dangerous landing, a risky gamble, and a lot of men staring at the ocean behind them thinking, well, I guess we live in Spain now. History loves a symbolic doorway, but sometimes the doorway is a beach, a general, and a burning boat. Segment 3, and when high ground meets low judgment. In 1296, Scotland faced England at the Battle of Dunbar, and for one beautiful moment, the Scots had the thing every army wants, the high ground. They were positioned above the English, near the Lammermuir Hills, looking down on John de Warenne's forces as the English crossed the difficult Spot Burn. The English knights had to break formation to navigate the marshy terrain, which looked from above like panic. The Scots saw this and shouted, "They flee! They flee!" Now, in fairness, misreading a battlefield is easy. Misreading a battlefield while standing in the strongest position and then abandoning it is how you turn military advantage into a cautionary workplace training video. The Scots charged downhill in disorder, only to discover that the English were not fleeing, they were reforming. By the time the Scottish army reached the bottom, the English cavalry was ready, disciplined, and waiting like a steel wall with excellent timing. The result was a devastating rout, mass capture of Scottish nobles, the collapse of John Balliol's kingship, and Edward I hauling away symbols of Scottish sovereignty, including the Stone of Destiny. Balliol would later be mocked as Tomb Tabard, the empty coat, after the royal arms were stripped from him, which is a medieval insult so visual it practically comes with a political cartoon. Dunbar matters because it shows how fragile sovereignty can become when political weakness meets battlefield arrogance. It also proves one eternal truth. Just because your enemy looks disorganized does not mean they are losing. Sometimes they are simply crossing a creek, and you are about to become the example in the history book. Segment 4, and great men, small beaches, and bad decisions. On April 27, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan died at the Battle of Mactan, which is remarkable because he had already survived mutiny, starvation, shipwreck, desertion, oceanic uncertainty, and the terrifying discovery that the Pacific Ocean is not a small scenic shortcut. Magellan's expedition had reached the Philippines after an almost impossible voyage. But then Magellan inserted himself into local politics, allied with Raja Humabon of Cebu, and decided to defeat Humabon's rival, Lapu-Lapu, on the island of Mactan. This was not the spice trade. This was a side quest with spears. Magellan brought a small force of armored Europeans against far more local warriors, but the geography destroyed his advantages. The coral reefs kept Spanish ships too far offshore for cannon support. The soldiers had to wade through shallow water in heavy armor, and once they reached land, the Mactan warriors aimed for their exposed legs. That is the kind of tactical adjustment that says, "Nice breastplate, shame about your ankles." Magellan died in the surf, and Lapu-Lapu became a lasting symbol of indigenous resistance. Yet, the expedition continued under Juan Sebastian Elcano and completed the first circumnavigation of the globe, proving the Earth was far larger than many Europeans had imagined. The irony is brutal. Magellan helped reveal the scale of the planet, then died because he underestimated the scale of one island's resistance. History often calls men like Magellan visionaries, and sometimes they are. But vision does not help much when you are standing knee-deep in water, realizing the locals know the terrain better than you know humility. Segment 5, and liberty, law, and the machinery of survival. April 27th also shows how nations behave when survival and principle get into a fistfight. In 1810, Beethoven wrote the little piano piece we know as Für Elise, a bagatelle, meaning a trifle, which is hilarious because it became one of the most recognizable melodies ever composed. It was not published during his lifetime, and even the name may be a mistake, possibly a misreading of his terrible handwriting. The intended woman may have been Therese Malfatti, who rejected his marriage proposal, meaning one of history's most famous romantic melodies may actually be a monument to bad penmanship and romantic failure. Then, in 1861, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus along the vital route between Washington and Philadelphia, trying to keep Maryland from slipping into secession and trapping the capital. It was a desperate move in a desperate moment, and it created a constitutional crisis that still echoes. Chief Justice Roger Taney ordered the release of John Merryman, but the military refused, and Lincoln ignored the ruling. That is not a legal disagreement. That is three branches of government standing in a hallway pretending not to see each other. Lincoln's defenders argued the Union could not survive if saboteurs cut rail lines and strangled the Capitol. Critics argued that suspending basic legal protections was exactly the kind of emergency power that turns republics into armed guesses. Put Beethoven and Lincoln together, and April 27th asks a strange question. What lasts longer, law or longing? A president tested the Constitution to save the nation, while a rejected composer accidentally wrote a melody millions would learn before they could spell arpeggio. One man bent the rules of liberty. The other turned heartbreak into homework for piano students. Segment 6, and freedom arrives late, loud, and complicated. On April 27, 1865, the SS Satire exploded on the Mississippi River, killing more than 1,000 people, many of them Union soldiers who had survived Confederate prison camps and were finally headed home. The boat was built to carry 376 passengers, but it was packed with more than 2,000 people, because war may end, but greed keeps billing by the head. Its boilers were damaged, overloaded, and fighting a flooded river. When they exploded near Memphis, men who had survived starvation and disease were forced to choose between fire and freezing water. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. Yet, it was buried in the news beneath Lincoln's funeral and the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. That is almost too cruel for irony. Surviving the Civil War only to be erased by the news cycle. Then, in 1961, Sierra Leone became independent, raising its own flag, while the ceremony mixed liberation, British pageantry, beauty contests, banquets, and political arrests. Independence arrived with hope, but also with warnings about the authoritarian shadows that would follow. And in 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial election, exactly 44 years after the Group Areas Act helped cement apartheid's geography of cruelty. Millions stood in lines for hours, sometimes days, to vote for the first time. Nelson Mandela's victory ended apartheid politically, but what stunned the world was the restraint. Instead of revenge, he formed a government of national unity with former oppressors. April 27th reminds us freedom is rarely clean. Sometimes it comes after prison camps, colonial rule, racial dictatorship, and generations of people being told to wait. But when it arrives, even late, it can make the old system look very small, like a burning ship behind a people finally walking forward. In conclusion, April 27th is not a quiet date. It is a date of flames, crossings, collapses, gambles, songs, legal crises, disasters, independence ceremonies, and voting lines stretching across history. It shows us that power loves spectacle, but spectacle does not guarantee survival. Alexander burned a palace and called it victory. Rome threw itself a 1,000th birthday party while the floorboards were already giving way. Tariq crossed a strait and opened a civilization. Scotland charged downhill into disaster. Magellan circled toward immortality but died in someone else's local conflict. Beethoven wrote a trifle that became eternal. Lincoln saved the Union while rattling the Constitution. The Sultana turned homecoming into horror. Sierra Leone and South Africa stepped into freedom with celebration, risk, and memory all standing in the same room. History never hands us a simple moral, because history is not a greeting card. It is more like a courtroom transcript written during a fireworks accident.